The unbreakable bond begins. The twin moons of Typhorus hung in the dark sky, casting a silver glow over the ancient ceremonial ground. Hundreds of Typhorians, a tall and elegant alien race with glowing blue eyes and smooth, scale-like skin, gathered in a perfect circle. They stood in silence, their gazes fixed on the sacred platform in the center. Tonight was the choosing ceremony, a ritual that determined the lifelong bond between a young Typhorian and their destined partner. Jack Carter stood among them, feeling like an outsider. He had crash-landed on this planet nearly a year ago. The Typhorians had allowed him to stay, but he was still an oddity, a human among aliens. Tonight, he was only here as a guest, watching the ceremony out of curiosity. A deep drumbeat echoed through the air, and the ceremony began. The young Typhorians, no older than 12, stepped forward one by one. Their task was simple yet sacred. They had to choose their life-bonded partner. This bond was permanent, unbreakable, and more than just friendship. It was a connection of minds, emotions, and even survival. Jack watched as the first child, a boy with silver markings on his arms, placed his hand on the shoulder of a strong Typhorian warrior. A faint glow surrounded them, sealing their bond. One after another, the children chose, and the circle of onlookers clapped in approval. Then it was her turn. A young girl named Raylis stepped forward. She was smaller than the others, her deep violet eyes filled with uncertainty. She hesitated, scanning the crowd. The elders watched her closely. A Typhorian could feel their destined bond. It was never wrong. But Raylis seemed confused. Jack noticed her hesitation. He wasn't sure why, but something about her reminded him of himself, lost, uncertain, searching for a place to belong. Then, in a move that shocked everyone, Raylis turned her gaze to him. Jack froze. She took a step forward, then another. Gasps filled the crowd. The murmurs turned into a wave of disbelief. No Typhorian had ever bonded with an outsider. A human. It was unheard of. Impossible. Jack opened his mouth to protest, but before he could react, Raylis reached out and placed her small, trembling hand on his arm. A blinding light erupted from the point of contact. Jack felt it immediately, a rush of warmth, like fire spreading through his veins. His mind became light, as if something deep inside him had awakened. He heard a voice. Her voice. "Why? Why did I choose you?" Jack gasped, his eyes widening. He wasn't just hearing her. He could feel her emotions. The fear, the confusion, the strange sense of connection. Raylis took a step back, staring at her own hands as if they belonged to someone else. She was just as shocked as he was. The elder stepped forward, his expression unreadable. His deep voice cut through the stunned silence. "The bond has been made." Murmurs erupted among the warriors. Some whispered that the ceremony should be stopped. Others said it was an omen, a sign of something unnatural. One of the strongest warriors, General Kale, stepped forward, anger flashing in his bright blue eyes. "This is a mistake," he growled. "A human cannot bond with a Typhorian. The law does not allow it." The elder remained silent for a long moment. Then, in a grave tone, he spoke again. "The law does not choose. The bond does." A chill ran down Jack's spine. The meaning was clear. This bond, whatever it was, could not be undone. Jack turned to Raylis, expecting her to look relieved, but instead she looked terrified. Her hands shook, and her breath came in quick gasps. She whispered, "What have I done?" Jack didn't have an answer. The aftermath. The ceremony ended in an uneasy silence. The other Typhorians kept their distance from Jack and Raylis, their eyes filled with curiosity and fear. Jack wanted to tell them there had been a mistake. He didn't belong in this. He wasn't even Typhorian. But when he tried to step away, he felt an invisible pull, like an unseen thread binding him to Raylis. The bond was real. He could feel her presence in his mind, a soft pulse at the back of his thoughts. Ryllis refused to look at him. Her shoulders were tense, her small hands curled into fists. Jack sighed. "Look, kid, I don't know what just happened, but if you want out of this, I'm all for it." She flinched at his words, but she didn't reply. The elder approached, his expression still unreadable. "You must understand something, human," he said. "The choosing ceremony is sacred. The bond is more than tradition. It is life itself. If the bond is rejected, both of you will suffer." Jack frowned. "Suffer how?" The elder's gaze darkened. "The bond is connected to your very existence. If it is broken, it will break you too." Ryllis's breath hitched. "You mean we could die?" The elder did not answer, but his silence spoke louder than words. Jack swallowed hard. He had been through a lot in his life. War, loss, the endless void of space, but nothing had prepared him for this. He glanced at Ryllis again. She looked as scared as he felt. A lifetime bond. He barely knew this girl. And now, they were connected forever, whether they liked it or not. The night was silent, but Jack knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning, a forced connection or fate. The air was thick with tension as the last echoes of the choosing ceremony faded into the night. The Typherian people had left the sacred ground, whispering among themselves about what had just happened. A human, bonded to one of their own. It was something out of legends, something that wasn't supposed to be real. Jack Carter stood in the center of it all, watching the Typherians disappear into the shadows of their towering stone structures. He still felt the strange warmth buzzing under his skin, a lingering pulse of energy from whatever had just happened between him and Ryllis. The young Typherian girl stood several feet away, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She refused to look at him. Jack took a deep breath. "Okay, kid. What now?" Ryllis flinched at his voice, but she didn't respond. He could feel her emotions flickering through the bond. Confusion, fear, frustration. Jack wasn't used to feeling someone else's emotions inside his own mind. It was like standing too close to an exposed power line, an invisible force humming between them. Suddenly, a sharp pain stabbed into his skull. Jack gritted his teeth and pressed a hand to his temple. What the hell? The pain came from her. Ryllis gasped and fell to her knees, gripping her head. Her breathing was rapid, uneven. Jack rushed to her side. Hey, what's happening?" The pain doubled, like a knife twisting behind his eyes. Jack swore under his breath. Through the agony, he could hear Ryllis's thoughts. Not in words, but in raw emotion. Panic, guilt, regret. She was trying to break the bond. Jack barely managed to choke out, "Stop. Whatever you're doing. Stop it." Ryllis let out a strangled cry. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the pain vanished. Jack collapsed onto the grass, breathing hard. His head still pounded, but at least it wasn't trying to split open anymore. Ryllis sat beside him, her hands trembling in her lap. Her violet eyes were wide, filled with terror. "I tried to break it," she whispered. "But I couldn't. It won't let me." Jack pushed himself up, rubbing his face. "You think I want this either?" He exhaled sharply. "Look, I don't know what kind of magic or alien science this is, but one thing's for sure, we can't fight it." Ryllis turned away, gripping the fabric of her ceremonial robe. This isn't how it was supposed to be. Jack almost felt bad for her. He was an outsider, sure, but at least he had no expectations. This girl had spent her whole life believing in the sacred tradition of the bond. And now she was stuck with someone who didn't belong. Before he could say anything else, a voice cut through the night. "Come with me. Now." Jack turned to see an elder Typherian standing nearby. The man's gaze was unreadable, but his tone left no room for argument. Jack and Ryllis exchanged wary glances before following him through the stone pathways of the village. They passed tall, glowing crystals embedded in the structures, their blue light casting long shadows in the darkness. At last, they arrived at a grand circular chamber, its walls etched with swirling symbols that pulsed faintly. The elder faced them, his piercing eyes locking onto Jack. "You do not understand the bond, human. It is not a choice. It is a force older than our civilization itself." Jack crossed his arms. "Yeah, I kinda figured that out when I nearly blacked out from brain pain." The elder ignored his sarcasm. "This bond is permanent. The more you resist, the more it will fight back. If you break it," he hesitated, "you may not survive." Jack frowned. "Not survive? You mean me or her?" "Both of you," the elder said gravely. Relis inhaled sharply. "No, there has to be a way. A mistake like this has never happened before." The elder turned his gaze to her. "Has it?" A deep silence filled the chamber. Jack felt something stir in his gut. The elder knew more than he was saying. Before Jack could question him, another Cypherian entered the room. It was General Kale, the warrior who had been furious during the ceremony. His cold blue eyes locked onto Jack with thinly veiled disgust. "This abomination of a bond cannot be allowed to continue," Kale growled. "The human is weak. He has no place in our ways. Rylus must choose again." The elder shook his head. "It is not our decision to make. The bond has chosen." Kale clenched his jaw. "Then let him prove himself." Jack narrowed his eyes. "Prove myself? How?" Cal's lips curled into a smirk. "A trial of worthiness. At dawn." Rylus's eyes widened. "That's not fair. He's not even one of us." Kale ignored her. "If the human is truly meant to be bonded to one of our kind, he will survive. If not, the bond will be broken." Jack exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "Great. Alien hazing rituals. Just what I needed." But there was no backing out. Relis looked at him, a flicker of worry passing through her expression. She didn't want him to get hurt. And strangely, Jack realized, he didn't want to let her down. Tomorrow, he would fight. And one way or another, this bond would decide his fate. A dark secret about the bond. Jack Carter stood at the edge of the ceremonial combat ring, the weight of 1,000 alien eyes on him. The cool, Cypherian night air buzzed with energy, anticipation, and something deeper. Fear, not his own. Rylus. He could feel it through the bond. She stood on the sidelines, fists clenched at her sides, her violet eyes filled with a mixture of worry and frustration. She hadn't wanted him to accept the trial of worthiness. But Jack hadn't had a choice. If he refused, the bond would be forcibly broken, and according to the elder, that could mean death for both of them. Jack rolled his shoulders, sizing up his opponent. General Kale, a towering Cypherian warrior, muscles coiled like steel cables beneath his deep blue skin. His piercing silver eyes burned with disdain, as if Jack's very existence was an insult to his people. The ceremonial staff in Cal's hands hummed with raw energy, the weapon pulsating in tune with his breath. Jack, on the other hand, had been given a stick. Well, not quite a stick. A combat staff made from a Cypherian mineral called velstone. Lighter than steel, but rumored to be nearly unbreakable. It was still a joke of a weapon compared to Cal's. The elder raised his hand. The murmurs around the ring ceased instantly. "This is a test, not a slaughter. The trial will end when one combatant yields or is incapacitated." Jack exhaled. "Great. So as long as I don't die, I win. Sounds easy." The elder's voice carried across the arena. "Begin." Kale moved like lightning. Before Jack could even process it, the warrior was already in front of him. Jack barely had time to raise his staff before Cal's strike sent a jarring shock through his arms. The impact almost knocked him off his feet. "Damn, he's fast." Jack stumbled backward, adjusting his stance. He had been in fights before, back in his military days, back when Earth still meant something to him. But this was different. Kale came at him again, his movements precise and unrelenting. He wasn't just attacking, he was testing Jack, finding his weaknesses. Jack gritted his teeth and dodged left, barely avoiding a strike that would have shattered ribs. He retaliated, sweeping his staff toward Cal's midsection, but the warrior caught it effortlessly and twisted. The next thing Jack knew, he was flat on his back, gasping for air. Rylas's fear spiked through the bond. Jack coughed, tasting blood. "All right, that's enough playing around." Cale loomed over him, expecting an easy finish. But Jack wasn't done. Not by a long shot. He rolled to the side as Cal's staff came down, narrowly missing his skull. Using the momentum, Jack kicked out, sweeping Cal's legs out from under him. The crowd gasped. Cale hit the ground hard, caught off guard. Jack didn't hesitate. He lunged, staff aimed at Cal's throat. The warrior smirked. A powerful shockwave of energy exploded from Cal's body, sending Jack flying back. He crashed against the ground, pain lancing through his ribs. Cale stood, rolling his shoulders. "You're not completely useless, human." Jack groaned, pushing himself up. "Gee, thanks." Cal's expression darkened. "But you are not worthy of the bond." Something inside Jack snapped. It wasn't just about the fight anymore. It wasn't even about proving himself. It was about Rylas. For some reason, the idea of losing this bond, losing her, twisted in his chest like a knife. Jack gripped his staff tighter. "You're wrong." He surged forward. Cale swung, but this time Jack was ready. He ducked under the attack, using his smaller size to his advantage. He moved like a soldier, his instincts taking over. Dodge. Strike. Redirect. Cale faltered for the first time. Jack saw it, the slight hesitation in the warrior's movements. Jack didn't let up. He landed a solid hit against Cal's ribs, forcing the Typherian back. The crowd's murmurs shifted. They had expected Jack to lose. But now they were watching. Cale roared and came at him with everything he had. Jack prepared to counter. But suddenly, pain shot through his head. Not his pain. Rylas. He saw her collapse outside the ring, clutching her head. Her breath was ragged, her entire body trembling. Jack's guard slipped for half a second, and Cal's staff slammed into his chest. Jack hit the ground hard, vision swimming. The elder raised his hand. "Enough." Cale stepped back, breathing heavily. "He is unworthy." Jack groaned, forcing himself up, but his gaze was locked on Rylas. She was still on the ground, her breathing erratic. Something was wrong. The elder knelt beside her, his expression grave. "The bond. It's rejecting her." Jack's blood ran cold. Cale turned to the elder. "Break it." Jack barely heard him. He pushed himself up, staggering toward Rylas. She was in pain, because of him. The elder's voice was quiet but firm. "If we break the bond now, it could destroy them both." Cal's jaw clenched. "Then let the girl choose again." Rylas let out a weak breath. Her eyes fluttered open. Jack knelt beside her. "Rylas." Her gaze met his, and for the first time, he saw something other than fear. Trust. She reached for him, her fingers brushing his. The moment they touched, the pain in Jack's head vanished. The elder stared at them. His expression shifted, not just realization, but recognition. This has happened before. Cale stiffened. Impossible. The elder shook his head. No. The ancient records speak of this bond, a bond that was never meant to exist, yet has returned. The air grew heavy. Jack looked at Rylas. She looked at him. Something deep inside whispered that this was bigger than them. Something ancient, something dangerous. Jack clenched his fists. What the hell had they gotten themselves into? The attack, and a test of loyalty. The night was thick with tension, as if the very air of Typhorus held its breath. Jack sat near the sacred fire, his mind tangled in thoughts. The bond between him and Rylas was real. He had felt it. seen its power. But it was also dangerous, something no one fully understood, something ancient and forgotten. Across from him, Rylas sat with her arms wrapped around her knees. She hadn't spoken much since the trial. The way she looked at him had changed, not with fear, but with something uncertain, something questioning. The elder's words echoed in Jack's mind. This has happened before. But when? With who? And why had it been erased from history? Jack exhaled, trying to clear his mind. The flickering light of the fire cast shifting shadows on Rylas's face. She was exhausted, but she wasn't sleeping. Neither was he. "You're different," she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" Rylas hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "You don't act like the others. You don't try to prove yourself, but you fight anyway." She turned to him, her violet eyes reflecting the fire. "Why?" Jack sighed, leaning back against the stone wall. "I don't know. Maybe because I've spent my whole life fighting for something, even when I didn't know what it was." Rylas studied him, as if trying to understand something. "I shouldn't have chosen you." Jack chuckled dryly. No argument there. She didn't laugh. Instead, she whispered, "But I don't regret it." Before Jack could respond, a distant boom shattered the silence. A tremor shook the ground beneath them. Rylas's head snapped up, her breath hitching. What was that? Jack was already on his feet. His instincts screamed danger. The next explosion was closer. From the village below, cries rang out. A deep, guttural horn blared through the night, one Jack had never heard before, but he didn't need to understand the Typherian language to know what it meant. They were under attack. The Vorleth invasion. Jack and Rylas sprinted toward the high ridge overlooking the village. Below, fire erupted in the darkness, the peaceful Typherian settlement now a battlefield. Dark figures poured through the main gates, moving like shadows. Their massive, armored bodies gleamed under the twin moons, their elongated claws slicing through stone and flesh alike. Jack's stomach twisted. Vorleth raiders. He had read about them in the Typherian archives, a warrior race that thrived on destruction and conquest. For centuries, they had fought against Cypherus, always kept at bay by the warriors of the planet. But tonight, they were winning. Cypherian soldiers rushed to defend their home, but they were outnumbered, overwhelmed. The Vorleth were too fast, too strong. Jack clenched his jaw. This wasn't a battle. It was a massacre. Rylas stood frozen beside him, her hands trembling. We have to go." Jack turned to her, his expression unreadable. "No, we have to fight." She looked at him in shock. "Are you insane? You're not one of us. You don't even have a weapon." Jack took a step closer. "That bond, whether we like it or not, it's real. I can feel you, Rylas, and you can feel me. Right now, I can feel your fear, but I can also feel something else." She swallowed hard. "What?" Jack grabbed her wrist, placing her hand over his heart. "Courage." For a moment, she just stared at him. Then, something inside her shifted. Her fingers tightened around his wrist. For the first time, she didn't back away. The battle below. Jack and Rylas made their way down into the chaos. The Typherian warriors were falling back, their defenses crumbling. The Vorleth leader, a hulking brute covered in dark armor, stood in the center, watching his army tear through the village. Jack's blood boiled. "We take him down, we have a chance." Rylas stared at him. "How? You're a human. You don't have our strength." Jack smirked. "Maybe not, but I have something better." Before she could question him, he closed his eyes and reached for the bond. A strange energy surged through his veins. He could feel Rylas's heartbeat, her emotions, her instincts. And then something incredible happened. He could see through her eyes. Rylas gasped. "Jack, what are you?" Jack moved. For the first time, his body responded with the grace and precision of a Cypherian warrior. He dodged a Vorlath's attack effortlessly, moving as if he had trained for years. The bond wasn't just a connection. It was a weapon. Ryllis felt it too. She rushed forward, her body moving in sync with his. She struck first, her blade slicing through the Vorlath's armor. Jack followed, using his agility to strike at weak points she could sense, but he couldn't see. They were fighting as one. The Vorlath weren't prepared for this. The leader snarled, stepping forward. His dark red eyes locked onto Jack. A human. He let out a low, rumbling laugh. "You think you can stand against me?" Jack twirled his stolen blade, his stance steady. "No." Ryllis stepped beside him. "We can." The Vorlath leader charged. Jack and Ryllis moved as one, their attacks fluid, their minds connected. Jack ducked and rolled, striking at the leader's exposed flank. Ryllis leaped into the air, her blade slicing across his shoulder. The leader staggered. For the first time, the Vorlath hesitated. Jack didn't let him recover. He lunged forward, driving his blade into the leader's side. Ryllis followed, landing the final blow. The Vorlath fell. Silence spread through the battlefield. The remaining raiders, seeing their leader fall, began to retreat. The Kypherians stared in shock. They had won. Jack exhaled, stepping back. His heartbeat slowed, his mind still buzzing from the intensity of the battle. He turned to Ryllis. She was staring at him, not with fear, but with something new. Respect. Maybe even trust. The elder stepped forward, his gaze unreadable. "The bond is not a mistake." He looked at Jack. "It is a prophecy." Jack's stomach twisted. Whatever this bond was, it was only beginning. Betrayal and the shocking truth. The smoke from the battle still clung to the air, a heavy, burnt scent of charred wood, shattered stone, and blood. The twin moons of Typhorus hung low, casting eerie shadows across the ruined village. The once thriving settlement was now a battlefield of broken bodies and collapsed buildings. Jack Carter stood at the center of it all, his grip still tight on the blood-stained blade he had stolen from the Vorlath leader. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind a crushing weight of exhaustion. His muscles ached, his vision blurred at the edges, but he was still standing. And more importantly, so was Ryllis. She stood beside him, her violet eyes wide with something new. Not just relief, not just exhaustion, but something deeper. Understanding. The Typherian people had witnessed everything. They had seen their warriors fall, their traditions challenged, their future thrown into uncertainty. And they had also seen a human fight as one with one of their own. For the first time, Jack wasn't just an outsider. He was part of something. But before he could even begin to process what that meant, a familiar voice cut through the silence. "This changes nothing." Jack turned just in time to see General Kell step forward, his piercing silver eyes filled with barely contained rage. His armor, unlike the others, was spotless, as if he hadn't fought at all. Jack immediately felt a bad feeling settle in his gut. Kell scanned the ruins of the village, his jaw tightening. "You think a single victory changes what you are?" His gaze locked onto Jack, filled with disdain. "You are still a human. You do not belong here." Jack clenched his fists, but before he could respond, the elder stepped between them. "He fought beside us," the elder said. "He fought with honor. He saved our people." Cal's expression twisted into something unreadable. "And how many of our warriors had to die for this human to prove himself?" Jack stiffened. Cale turned to Ryllis, his voice sharp. "And you. You claim to be of our people, yet you bonded with an outsider. A bond that should never exist." Ryllis swallowed hard but didn't look away. "I didn't choose this," she said, her voice steady. "But I won't run from it either." Cal's lips curled into a smirk. "You may not have chosen it, but he did." Jack's brow furrowed. "What the hell does that mean?" Cale gestured toward the elder's temple, its ancient walls still standing despite the destruction around them. "The truth is inside. The truth about the bond. About what you really are." Jack glanced at Rylus. He could feel her uncertainty through the bond. But there was no hesitation in her eyes. She wanted answers. And so did he. The forbidden chamber. The temple's interior was colder than the night outside. Strange symbols lined the walls, pulsing with a faint, otherworldly light. The deeper they walked, the stronger Jack's bond with Rylus felt, like an invisible thread pulling him toward something he couldn't see, but somehow already knew. At the far end of the chamber, the elder stopped before an ancient stone monolith. It was cracked, worn by time, but the carvings were still visible, a story etched in stone. Jack's breath caught in his throat. There, in the faded carvings, was a human figure, a human warrior, standing beside a Cypherian. Rylus gasped. That's impossible. Humans aren't part of our history. The elder ran his fingers over the carvings, his expression unreadable. That's what we were taught. Jack stepped closer, tracing the ancient symbols. What is this? The elder exhaled slowly. The lost prophecy. The room grew silent. Then the elder began to speak. The truth about the bond. Long ago, before even our oldest records, Cypherians and humans were connected. Our people did not evolve separately. We were intertwined. Jack's heart pounded. You're saying humans and Cypherians were allies? The elder hesitated. Then, slowly, he shook his head. No, we were one people. The words hit Jack like a physical blow. One people. That didn't make sense. Humans had evolved on Earth. Cypherians evolved on this planet. How could they have been connected? Rylus stepped forward. But if that's true, why don't we know this? The elder's expression darkened. Because someone erased it. Someone hid the truth. Jack felt a chill crawl up his spine. Why? The elder turned to face them fully. Because the bond is not just a connection between two souls. He looked at Rylus. It is power. A power that once changed everything. Asterisk, asterisk. Jack and Rylus exchanged a glance. Power? What kind of power? Kel's voice cut through the silence. The kind that could destroy us all. Jack turned sharply, his instincts flaring. Kel stepped forward, his hands clasped behind his back. Do you think the Vorlath came here by chance? He let the words sink in before answering. They came because of you. Jack narrowed his eyes. What are you talking about? Kel exhaled sharply. The Vorlath didn't attack us for land. They attacked because they sensed something awakening. A power they feared. His gaze locked onto Jack. And that power is inside of you. Jack's stomach dropped. Kel smirked. Now do you see? You weren't chosen by accident. You were chosen because you are a relic of something that should have died long ago. Rylus shook her head. That's not true. Kel stepped closer. Isn't it? He looked at Jack. Tell me, human, haven't you felt it? The way your body moves, the way you fight. That's not training. That's the bond. Jack's mind reeled. He had moved faster, fought stronger than he ever had before. And when he fought beside Rylus, it was as if their minds were one. But that wasn't normal. It was something more. Kel's voice was cold. That power was lost for a reason. The elder sighed. No, General Kel. It was stolen. Jack's fists clenched. He had spent his whole life looking for purpose, and now he was learning that he was part of something ancient, something erased from history. But why? And who had hidden the truth? The elder turned to Jack and Rylus, his eyes solemn. This bond is not a mistake. It is a warning. A heavy silence filled the chamber. Jack exhaled slowly. Then I guess we better find out what we're warning against. The prophecy comes true. The silence in the ancient chamber was thick, pressing down on Jack and Rylus like a heavy weight. The monolith before them, carved with long-forgotten symbols, whispered of a history erased, a bond that had once united two civilizations, but had been buried in time. Jack exhaled sharply, his mind racing. The bond between him and Raylis wasn't just some random accident. It was something bigger, older, and more dangerous than either of them had realized. The elder traced the carvings with his fingers, his expression unreadable. The last time this bond appeared, it changed the course of history. Jack swallowed. Changed it how? The elder's voice was grave. It nearly destroyed us. Raylis tensed beside Jack. He could feel the fear creeping through their bond, an undercurrent of unease neither of them could shake. Cale scoffed from the shadows. And yet here we are again. A new bond, a new war. Jack turned to face him, his patience running thin. What do you know, Cale? You seem awfully eager to act like I'm the enemy here. Cale's silver eyes gleamed. Because I know what you are. A sharp silence followed. Jack's jaw tightened. Then tell me. Cale took a slow step forward, his gaze locked onto Jack's. The prophecy speaks of a human and a Cypherian forming a bond unlike any other. But it doesn't say whether that bond will bring salvation or destruction. Jack scoffed. Great, so I'm either the hero or the villain. Cale smirked. Depends on how you play your part. Jack rolled his shoulders, already tired of this cryptic nonsense. Then how about we stop playing games and figure out what's really going on? Before anyone could respond, a distant rumble echoed through the temple. The ground beneath them vibrated. Dust fell from the cracked stone ceiling. Raylis's breath hitched. That didn't sound good. The elder's face darkened. Something has awakened. Jack barely had time to process those words before a deep roar erupted from outside. The awakening. Jack and Raylis rushed out of the temple and onto the high ridge overlooking the ruins of the village. What they saw made Jack's stomach drop. The Vorlith forces hadn't retreated. They had been waiting. Hundreds of black-armored warriors stood in formation at the outskirts of the settlement. Their glowing red eyes burned like embers, their weapons gleaming under the twin moons. And at their center, a monstrous figure emerged, a creature unlike anything Jack had ever seen. It was twice the size of any Vorlith, its body encased in jagged obsidian armor. Deep crimson veins pulsed across its body, as if something ancient and unnatural burned within. When it moved, the very air seemed to shudder. Raylis stumbled back, horror flashing across her face. No, that can't be. Jack frowned. What the hell is that thing? The elder's voice was barely a whisper. A guardian. Jack's stomach twisted. Guardian of what? Cale, standing beside them now, answered with a voice like steel. Guardian of the past. Before Jack could respond, the guardian lifted its massive weapon, a war axe taller than a Cypherian warrior, and drove it into the ground. A shockwave exploded outward, sending cracks through the earth, splitting the ruined buildings in half. Cypherian warriors struggled to hold their ground. Jack felt the force hit him like a truck. He barely managed to stay upright. Then the guardian spoke. The Boendi Ahes Returnd. Its voice wasn't just sound. It was inside Jack's mind, inside Raylis's. The sheer power of it made Jack's head throb. The last of the Shachozen. T faded. Jack clenched his fists, trying to shut out the overwhelming force of the voice. Yeah, well, fate can go screw itself. Raylis shot him a sharp look. Jack, maybe don't taunt the giant death monster. The guardian lifted its axe again, this time aiming at them. Jack's instincts screamed. Move. The bond's power awakens. The moment the guardian swung, Jack didn't think. He reacted. His body moved faster than should have been possible, dodging just before the massive blade struck. Dust and debris exploded around him. He grabbed Raylis and pulled her out of the way just in time. She stared at him, breathless. How? How did you do that? Jack blinked. He had no idea. But then he felt it. The bond was growing stronger, not just linking them emotionally, but physically. Somehow, it was enhancing him. and he wasn't the only one. Ryllis moved her hands instinctively, and to both their shock, a wave of energy blasted outward, sending 3 Vorleth warriors flying. She gasped. "I didn't." Jack grinned. "Oh, hell yeah." Kale, watching from the sidelines, looked on with a mixture of awe and horror. "This is impossible." Jack rolled his shoulders, a sudden sense of confidence settling over him. "Buddy, I don't think impossible means what you think it does." But the Guardian wasn't done. It charged. Jack and Ryllis barely had time to react before the creature was upon them, swinging its massive axe with terrifying speed. Jack dodged, countering with a strike of his own, but his blade barely scratched its armor. Ryllis threw up her hands again, trying to summon whatever energy had exploded from her before, but this time the Guardian anticipated it. It grabbed her by the throat. Ryllis choked, her body thrashing. The Guardian lifted her off the ground with terrifying ease. Jack's vision blurred with rage. He felt the bond burn inside him, hotter, stronger than before. He wasn't going to let this happen. Not again. Not ever. Something inside him snapped. Jack roared, his body moving on pure instinct. He lunged forward, faster than the eye could follow. Before the Guardian could react, Jack leaped into the air and drove his fist into its chest. The impact sent a shockwave across the battlefield. The Guardian staggered. Jack landed on the ground, breathing hard. Something was different. He looked down at his hands. They were glowing. Ryllis, coughing as she hit the ground, looked up at him in shock. "Jack, what are you?" The Guardian, now truly watching him, rumbled in a voice like rolling thunder. "The true power returns." Jack wiped the sweat from his forehead, grinning through the exhaustion. "Yeah. Well, let's see how much of it I've got left." The final battle was about to begin. And this time, Jack wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting for the truth. The final stand. A new era begins. The battlefield was chaos. The Guardian's massive form towered above them, its glowing crimson veins pulsing with raw energy. The air itself felt heavier, thick with something ancient, something awakened. The Vorleth warriors had halted their attack, standing at a distance, watching in eerie silence. They, too, could feel the shift in power. Jack stood in the center of it all, his fists still glowing with the strange energy that had ignited inside him. His breathing was heavy, his body thrumming with a force he didn't understand. Across from him, Ryllis pushed herself to her feet, rubbing her throat where the Guardian had grabbed her. She turned to him, her violet eyes filled with something between awe and terror. "Jack, what did you just do?" He didn't have an answer, because he didn't know. But the Guardian did. Its burning eyes locked onto him, and when it spoke, its voice wasn't just sound. It was inside Jack's head, inside his very bones. "You HFY Sci-Fi, the forgotten blood." Jack's heart pounded. The hell does that mean? The Guardian didn't answer. It simply raised its massive axe, and the ground beneath them shattered. Jack reacted instantly, lunging forward just as the enormous weapon came crashing down. A split second too slow, and he would have been dead. The impact alone sent a shockwave across the battlefield, knocking Cypherian warriors and Vorleth alike off their feet. Ryllis threw up her hands, summoning the same burst of power she had before. A shockwave erupted outward, striking the Guardian square in the chest. It barely stumbled. Jack gritted his teeth. "Okay, so we're gonna need a new plan." Kale, watching from the sidelines, shouted at the Cypherian warriors. "Hold your ground. Protect the Elder." The Guardian charged again, swinging its axe in a devastating arc. Jack dodged, barely missing the blade as it carved through stone like butter. He leaped onto the shattered ruins of a nearby wall, his mind racing. If he could just figure out how to control whatever this power was. The Guardian turned toward him. Then suddenly, it hesitated. Jack frowned. Why was it pausing? Why was it staring at him like that? And then it hit him. It wasn't looking at him. It was looking at the bond. Jack turned his gaze to Rylus, his mind still buzzing with energy. And then it clicked. The Guardian had recognized the bond. It wasn't here to destroy them. It was here to test them. The final trial. Jack leaped down from the ruins and landed beside Rylus. He grabbed her wrist, feeling the warmth of the bond pulse between them. "I think I get it now." She looked at him, confused. "What?" Jack's eyes burned with realization. "We're not supposed to fight it." Rylus's breath hitched. "Then what are we supposed to do?" Jack exhaled. "Prove we're worthy." Before she could question him, he reached for the bond. Fully, completely. Something shifted. The world around them seemed to slow. The noise of the battlefield faded, and suddenly, Jack could feel everything. Rylus's heartbeat, the energy around them, the Guardian's ancient presence, watching, waiting. And deep inside him, something even older. Power. A power buried in his blood, in his bones, in his very existence. Not human. Not Cypherian. Both. Jack turned to Rylus, their gazes locking. She could feel it too. The truth. This was what had been erased from history. Not war. Not destruction. A union. Something that shouldn't have been possible. Yet here it was, happening again. Jack's grip on her wrist tightened. "Trust me." She hesitated for only a moment. Then she nodded. "Always." Together, they stepped forward. The Guardian lifted its axe once more, but this time, it didn't strike. It watched, waited, and then Jack and Rylus reached for the bond and released it. A brilliant explosion of light erupted between them, not of destruction, but of pure energy, so bright it forced the Vorlath warriors and Cypherians alike to shield their eyes. The air around them crackled with electricity, and for the first time in centuries, the Guardian knelt. A deep, rumbling voice filled the battlefield. "The Boendi is restored." Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the Guardian faded into mist, its enormous form dissolving into the very air itself. The battlefield fell into stunned silence. The Vorlath, realizing their advantage was gone, began to retreat, their forces breaking apart in fear and confusion. The Cypherian warriors stood in shock. Even Kel, who had spent his life believing the bond was a mistake, had no words. Jack, breathless and exhausted, sank to his knees. Rylus, equally drained, dropped beside him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, she whispered, "It's over." Jack let out a breathless laugh. "Yeah, I think it is. A new beginning." Hours later, after the wounded retreated and the fires had been put out, Jack stood at the edge of the village, watching the horizon. He felt different. Not just because of the battle, not just because of the power he had awakened, but because, for the first time in his life, he wasn't lost anymore. Rylus stepped beside him. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, close enough for him to feel her presence through the bond. Then, softly, she asked, "What happens now?" Jack exhaled. "I don't know." He turned to her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "But I think we're gonna find out together." She smiled back. And for the first time since the bond had been forged, it didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like a choice they would make every day, for the rest of their lives. Together. Epilogue. The prophecy lives on. Far beyond the ruined village, deep in the uncharted territories of space, a lone figure watched from the darkness of an ancient ship. They had seen the battle. They had felt the bond awaken. And they knew. This was just the beginning. The lost era of the bonded ones was returning. And the galaxy was not ready.